Okay, hello and welcome everybody to another webinar series by FarmQA. Today we're excited to announce and to showcase a new feature around how we can bring in Sentinel-2 satellite imagery and utilize that in our platform to be used for agronomic purposes. So today I'll walk through a couple things. One, I'll just give a brief overview of what Sentinel is, make sure everybody's on the same page with that. And then we'll talk through how do you configure your FarmQA account to start viewing imagery. And then we'll get into the good stuff about how do you utilize that and make decisions based on the imagery. And with that, we can create management zones and prescriptions. You can view it on a mobile app and use that for directed scouting, or include that in the PDF reports that might go out to a client or a grower. And then we've got some analytics where you can start to look at that imagery year over year, or look at kind of broad scale trends across a series of fields or over a period of time. So we will cover all that. And with that, we'll spend, as usual, most of our time in a live demo. So just a couple of housekeeping things. If you have questions, there is a chat available within the Microsoft Teams meeting, and I'll be taking those questions at the end. So as I go through each section, feel free to put your questions in there, and we will take those at the end. And then, as always, contact FarmQA, me directly, or support@farmqa.com if you want to take a look at some of this data yourself inside your account. So Sentinel is a mission put forward to have 2 satellites in orbit, and it's multispectral band imagery. So as these satellites orbit the Earth, they have 13 bands of imagery, so red band, green bands included in that. And then what we do as FarmQA is we take that imagery, we clip that down to your field boundaries, and then we process that for different indexes. So based on those 13 different bands that are coming directly from the satellite, we'll process that into things like NDVI, MSAVI, and a handful of other indexes. The cadence of these satellites, so Sentinel, like I said, there's 2 satellites in orbit, and they are semi-synchronous, so they will give images every 5 to 7 days, and the resolution is 10 meters. So what that means in practicality is each pixel is 10 meters by 10 meters in size, and then if there's cloud cover, we have a filter around that as well, so we'll only deliver the quality imagery that you would want in your account. So with that, that is an overview on Sentinel. You can certainly go to that website and learn more about that mission if you have questions, or ask us directly. Now, as far as what we do with the imagery or how we take that in. So Sentinel, as they orbit the Earth, they're capturing imagery, and the imagery itself, they capture on 180-mile swaths across the globe. And so as you can imagine, those are very large files, TIFF files, that we then take, and we will say, okay, of this area, of these boundaries, let's clip that big file down and deliver that down to those field boundaries, so that's more consumable for you as our customers. So what I'll walk through next is how we allow you to configure which fields you want imagery for, and configure a few other things around the cloud cover settings and the indexes. So what I've done to show this is I've got a fresh enterprise that has no prior imagery. And so this would be a scenario, let's see, I got to change access levels here quick. This would be a scenario where you would be granted access to have imagery in your account. And so that would be through contacting myself or support and indicating that you wanted to either trial some imagery or purchase a bucket of imagery through us. And so we would configure that within your account. And when I say configure, that's simply just allocating how many acres you've purchased of the Sentinel imagery. So in this particular enterprise, I have 20,000 acres allocated to myself. And then on this screen, this is where I can do my configuration. And so as I mentioned before, we take that imagery with it being multispectral, and we can break that down into different indexes. And with this, don't feel overwhelmed by these different options. There's a lot of resources available to understand the use cases of any one of these indexes. But you can also simplify your account and say, I only care about, let's say, visual imagery and NDVI. Those are by far the most common scenarios in the industry, but you can also grant yourself access to these different indexes. And this exact flow I'm going through, you can do as a customer. So this is not a FarmQA admin setup. This would be a user admin level control where you're choosing which indexes you want to have processed within your FarmQA account. In addition to that, we have date selectors. So as we pull in Sentinel imagery, you can choose what time windows you want to have processed. So for example, in the Midwest, you may not care about, let's say, November through February. And so with that, we just will not process any images from that time window, and it will keep your account cleaner, less data laying around that's not useful, with that being, say, snow covered. In addition to that, you can set your cloud cover percentage. And so as I mentioned, Sentinel is capturing image every 5 to 7 days, but perhaps on the capture, there is 100% cloud cover. There's no usable imagery for yourself. With this filter, you're telling us we don't want that, let's filter it out. So I can set this as 10%, I can set this to 25, whatever you want that to be, but that is going to be the gate of what we allow through into your account. In addition, so the Sentinel mission has been in orbit for quite a few years. And so with that, we can backfill imagery on your fields up to 5 years. And so this is the time picker where you're telling our system how far back do you want imagery. And so in my case, I'm saying I want May 1st, go back from today all the way back to May 1st and give me all the imagery you have that's 25% cloud cover or better or clearer, if you will, and only for these selected month ranges. And so those are our kind of the levers and dials that you have within the initial setup. And you can come back in and change this if needed, but this is what's available to you. And then the final piece to this would be your self-serve in choosing what fields you want imagery for. So as I mentioned, I've got 20,000 acres allocated to myself. I want to start to consume that. You can filter this list view down by a producer or by crop or field names. You can search up here, let's say field 117, and I could choose that. Or I could say I want imagery on everything and do a select all. But this is, again, self-serve in here to choose your fields. And then if I were to click update, I would then start pulling imagery for those additional fields that I've highlighted. And I would also mention you can select from the map. So if you'd rather you're more of a visual selection, go through more visual selection process, I can do this from the map as well. And I can see my fields. And then within here, I can click, as you can see here. And as I do that, I have additional fields that are being consumed within my bucket. So then again, as I hit update, I would then start getting images flowing through for those sets of fields. And a quick plug I put in here as well is that we also support planet imagery. So if you want a combination to say I work with Munson Farms and he wants Sentinel on those sets of fields, then I've got Johnson Farms and they want high resolution, you within FarmQA can pick and choose what imagery source gets allocated to each field. So that is part of this process as well. But the kind of our benefit here is just that, again, you're self-serve in this process to configure your account and subscribe the fields that you care about. Real quickly, we do get a lot of questions on these indexes. And like I mentioned, there are quite a few resources available online for the different use cases, practical use cases in precision ag for these indexes. But just real quick from my perspective, we mentioned visible imagery, so that's fairly self-explanatory. That is no additional processing done. That's just more or less the raw visual spectrum image that we can just display back to you. MSAVI is an acronym for, we're using a couple different bands to come up with more of an early season index. And so the use case there would be before, let's say post-emergence, but before canopy closure, when there's a fair amount of bare soil being visible. You can use MSAVI to get more of a dynamic image, even though the bare soil is present. NDVI is probably, by far the most common use in agriculture, but I would just say that's mid-season. You're looking at crop vigor, I would explain it as, and so you're more or less looking at the health of a crop, and then that's also often what's used for zone creation, prescription writing. NDRE uses more of a red edge band. That's the RE in this acronym. And then with that, it's used more in the late season. So as that NDVI canopy closes, the plant matures, that NDVI will more or less flatline. It'll hit a plateau of being able to show variability in the field. The red edge band allows you to more or less penetrate that canopy and see more differences using that band later in the season. Similar on GNDVI, it's just using a green band instead of the red edge, and it's a similar use case just with different crops. So different crop types, you may want to use the GNDVI. And then red edge, there's resources out there indicating that you could look at chlorophyll or implied chlorophyll and nutrient status based on the red band maps. So with that, just a summary there, what I see having available in FarmQA is the MSAVI if you're looking or scouting or doing some assessments early in the season. MSAVI, NDVI is more mid-season, like I said, May to July perhaps, and then GNDVI, like I was saying, as the NDVI tops out, that's where the GNDVI and NDRE have more headspace in that y-axis range to still show variability throughout that time period. So with that, we'll jump in and show more of the how do you consume that imagery in our system. So let's picture we just hit that update button, and so that kicks off the processing in FarmQA where we start to backfill 5 years worth of imagery. And then in addition to that, we're clipping that to your fields and we're delivering that directly into your account. So let's and I will say that process runs nightly. If you need it more frequent than that, our support team does have an override where we can immediately get you imagery and kick off that backfill process. Now, the imagery is in my account, and so if I click on a particular field, and I now, let's close everything, kind of start from scratch. So clicking on a field in this left-hand panel, you see different sections. The imagery all lives within the layers section. So expanding that out, I have these different indexes we've talked about. And one additional point, I've mentioned NDVI, and we'll use that a lot in our demos here. What I would call out here is we see NDVI and dynamic NDVI. The NDVI option gives you a good comparison across fields. And the reason being is that we use a fixed NDVI range on that. So the values on NDVI run 0 to 1. And so we're going to run our color ramp or our scale on that fixed 0 to 1 range. And so that allows you to say, I want to look across all my cornfields, what's going on across those. The NDVI is a better visual comparison. Dynamic NDVI is going to take any given image and try to extrapolate the most differences within that image. So that might be other companies use more of a directed scouting type of a map or a scouting map. That would be what this is, where it's just extracting where the variability is within this image. And you can see we have those dynamic images versus the standard on each one of our indexes. So here I've selected NDVI and it's pulling up an image like you're seeing here. The other kind of key piece of information is on the bottom right. We have the date range. And so if I want to view imagery for the last 12 months, that's one of our kind of pre-canned views here. But you can also go into growing season mode and then use your growing season drop down to say, I want to look at imagery in 2021. And now that's what I see down here on the scales, my whole 2021 season, which I can slide through. And so as I do this, you'll notice just kind of the live load time on this data. And so you can slide through, and what I would say is once you've looked through the imagery for a season for the first time, then it loads a lot faster. So kind of slide through it once, and then you can see more of a dynamic change as they go through a period of time if you're looking for, let's say, crop damage or kind of what's changed in the last couple of weeks. So that's just kind of the simple visual consumption of that imagery. And what I'd also call out is as I toggle between these different options, so let's say I go from dynamic NDVI to visual, we will hold that date constant. So then you can do a very quick comparison between visual to NDVI to, let's say you want to look at MSAVI. And so with that, you can do those comparisons very quickly by toggling. So in addition to that, so we've viewed some images. A couple of things that I would call out would be if I, for example, I'm going to look at the 12 months, past 12 months again, more of a current time range. So within any given scenario here, we can look at not only the visual imagery, but you can look at more of a trend line. Because we have imagery coming in every 5 to 7 days, this allows a user to look at let's say a growth curve. And so with that, we've got, let me pull up an image again. You can view the imagery like we just talked about, but if you wanted to look at more of what's going on across the whole field and how's that trending to perhaps other fields. So in this case, I've got my NDVI growth curve displayed here. That should be a full screen here. Give me a second. And so what this is for that whole field, let's say this field is a quarter section, we are averaging the NDVI for each date that we have. And so as we look at this, you can see the average NDVI value per day that we have an image. And so it generates this growth profile or this curve through the whole season. And so what you can do with that is you can see more or less emergence to kind of when that canopied. You can see that rapid increase here to when that started to desiccate in this case. But what I would call out here is a quick access tool for any users. You can look at the histogram across that data. So I mentioned that NDVI range, but you can see where that data is falling for a given image. But you can also do a by season comparison. So at a glance, you can say currently this is a cornfield. The last year this was corn was in 2021. And so you can do a quick reference of this current season in pink versus the prior year in 2021. And I don't actually know if that was corn. So, but the example here is saying, I know I yielded, let's say 250 bushels in corn in 2021. And this year, our growth curve is looking similar, or it's more vigorous. And you can start to perhaps infer crop health and potential yield estimates on that. So this is a single kind of by-field comparison. And the point there is that you can look at the imagery, but in addition, you can look at more of the trend across the whole season with more of the raw data in a trend line like this. And we'll get in a little deeper into that comparison as well here in a minute. But the other thing I'd call out is people often say, I want to do more of that comparison across fields, like I mentioned, instead of just looking at that one field. So a feature we've added in is, first of all, you can search on, let's say, corn. So on the top right, my search bar, I search corn, but now I want to look at the imagery across all these corn fields at one time. So to do this, we have in this main map window, you can say show layers for multiple fields. So doing that, this allows me to display or choose an index and display that across all those fields. And in my case, I've still got that previous 12 months. So now if I slide back into, let's say, a time period that's going to show us more variability, now it'll load up all those NDVI images, so it's going to take a bit longer than just that single field view. But once they start to populate, then I can just pan around the map and view all those fields, looking at that dynamic NDVI in this case. And in addition to that, you can also slide through that similarly to what we did before. So we'll let that load up here. And then with that's including any of the indexes. So another use case here, just as a side note, is we have customers that look at, let's say, EC maps or zone maps in a similar fashion, where you could say, show me my zone maps across all the fields. So with this, here's the output of saying, here's my NDVI on this field, but as I scroll around, I'm seeing all those images at one time. And so with that, like I said, there's more buffer time with that, but if you're wanting to do a quick visual assessment, it's a nice way to say, okay, I'm going to dispatch my scouting team to the east half of our region, because we can see there's more need or there's more stress in that area. So again, that's the show multiple layers feature, and you can filter and then choose what you want to display. So in addition to that, a common use case is to view the same imagery on the mobile app. So a couple things to note on the mobile side is within settings down here, there's the layer sync preferences. And the reason I'm calling this out is this is where, if you want to have imagery available offline for use with zero connectivity, you can sync that imagery down. And with that, you can imagine that can be a lot of data. And so we give you some filters around that. And so you could say, how many days back do I want imagery? So maybe 100 days, 150 days if you're in the core of the season. I'm pulling back a lot of imagery just so I can show a lot from last season. But then in addition, you could say, I really just care about NDVI because we're in that maybe May to July time window, and that's the most relevant index at that time. And then the last thing I'd mention is you can also just pull in information or imagery for certain folders. So if you have certain clients, certain regions, now this would only pull down imagery for North Dakota farms if that's what I wanted to do in this case. And so with that being said, the value is that then we only pull down the data that's relevant for you at that time, and we don't bog down the mobile app with everything we've got for the whole time period. Now within the field, we have this layers button, this 3 vertical squares. If I slide that out, I now can access the imagery. So I've just pulled down visual and dynamic NDVI. And similar to the web, I can now slide through this and I can view that imagery real time. Now, the exception with this is I can also show my location. So my location would be projected on top of that map. And so that's where the directed scouting really comes in, is to see that image and again, see that the progression across that time period. And then if I wanted to scout, I could physically walk out and I could add an observation at this location. And we'll say, you know, this area, we've got high aphid damage, and I could take a picture at that point. It's all going to be geolocated, and then I could also draw on the map. So if I wanted to further designate an area, that's where using some of our draw tools, you could define the aphid severity. And again, that's all correlated back, and you could drop additional pins. And so that's part of the directed scouting flow. I could then submit that report. And a feature we've added in for the 2024 growing season is you can now include those NDVI images on your scouting reports. And so as you can see here, this is a different field I scouted in preparation for the webinar. But in this case, I've got my logo, this is my grower, and my field name. But traditionally, our map has just been a border. Now you can choose to show the most recent NDVI image on this field. And I kind of push this back into last season to get more of a relevant image. But now you can see that NDVI, or you can show just the visual imagery and choose what you wanted to display up here. And so that's kind of an automated feature that we include. And the way that works is as you go to export a report, so let's say I go into all my past scouting reports, I can now multi-select, but as I go to push these reports out, I had the option to choose a map layer to include. So this map layer, that's where you can choose to say, I want the NDVI, the visual spectrum, to be included on those scouting reports. And it'll be on the main map. And so that's kind of a cool additional feature here, is that it's a way to, let's say you're an agronomist consultant, work for co-op, you want the grower to see that imagery as well as a talking point, or just to show, hey, we were more efficient in your field by going to these spots. That can now be included. Going back into the web view. So we've scouted, we can view the imagery on mobile. I guess one thing I will call out, I did mention that you can view the imagery offline. So just simulating that, if I do go offline and say I have 0 connectivity, we do lose that base map. But as I mentioned, you can still scout and see that imagery in the same way that you did online. And with that, because we did that sync, we now have that imagery fully offline, and you can still scout, drop pins in the same way we did before. Now back on the web view. So we've talked through just viewing it, how you can see those trend lines. A couple additional things we'll mention here is a very common use case would be to take that imagery and to create management zones and prescriptions based on it. So we'll walk through that scenario. I'm going to go back into this grid sampling north field. And what I'll do is I'm going to pull up my dynamic NDVI. Again, that shows the most variability. But within this, I'm going to click on the little magnifying glass. And this pulls us into a view where we can select our images. Now with this, a common scenario is customers may want to go back multiple years. And so with that, with our backfill, I can go back, like I mentioned, 5 years. And so now if you look at my timeline, I can slide back into 2021 and look at the images mid-season. I can slide back into 2020 and 2019. And so that's kind of just giving us access to the full timeline on this field. But what we can do at this point is we can go back in and we can start to select the images we want to use to create zones. And so what I'll do here is I'm going to go back into, let's say, a July time range where I see a lot of variability. And a lot of people will say, soybean fields in June, July, they have a signature where they show a lot of the variability of the field itself. And so that's part of the backfill as well, as you can go back to a crop rotation year where it's soybeans for that specific time period. So I've chosen that image, I've got it selected. Now this little 4 square button is our zone creation tool. So getting into that mode, we can get into this scenario of how do you create zones. So our first window as part of this process is asking how many zones you want. So we could say 4 zones, 5 zones. There's really no limit here. I have been asked that, and we've done 30 zone maps with people before. So it really is your choice. I would certainly say commonly maybe 3 to 6 zones. You can choose your color ramp. Again, we'll default to red to green, as we know that's pretty common. You can invert that, show labels. And so at this point, we could just move forward and create the zones. And in fact, I'll do that. And so just our default functionality, we've set this up to create these zones and allow you to break those into those 5 categories. If I back up, what I will show as well in an advanced menu is that we do expose some of our clustering algorithms. So if you want to break this out in different ways, you can choose between our break methods. And this gets fairly into the weeds on how you want to take the pixels of the imagery and group those into like-minded buckets. But just real quickly, we've got equal interval, quantiles, and natural breaks. And as you go through here, we give you a little description of what those methods mean. I did kind of mock it up real quick. So equal interval, what this means is, let's say we're going to create a 4-zone map. And what we're looking at here is this is x-axis is the NDVI range that we've been talking about, 0 to 1. And this is the number of pixels we found in each one of those ranges. So let's say I'm going to create a 4-zone map. In this case, we're going to create a bucket that runs from 0 to 0.25 on the NDVI range, 0.25 to 5. And so you can see those are evenly spaced. That's what we call it, equal interval in this case. But now notice different percentages of that data could fall into each bucket. And so going back into my scenario here, where I had the equal interval set, I just changed that. So this will be quantiles. Let's go back to equal intervals. So in my case, what we'll notice here is that I do have 5 buckets, but you'll notice these top 2 buckets have very little area in them. And so that's one of the use cases on the equal interval, is you might have some pretty small buckets or quantity of data in those buckets. Quantiles, what this will do is this will ensure that equal amounts of data fall into each bucket. So again, we're talking NDVI and range 0 to 1. So now as we run a quantiles setup, this will not necessarily be a fixed range of, we talked about before, it was 25 to 50 to 75, those even breaks. These breaks will now be automated based on making sure 25% of the data is in each bucket, again, for a 4-zone setup to make the math easy. So if I were to run that, if I back out and I run a quantiles grouping, you can now see I'll get more variability because those buckets, we're trying to get 25% of data in each of the buckets. And so with that, if we toggle back and forth, you can see how the zones represent the imagery, in the sense that I've got a lot of that red area in this dark zone band corresponding there versus the green, as you can see, kind of the bottom left and the bottom right. So you can play with those options to come up with what you prefer. And then lastly is natural breaks. What this does is it's looking at the data set and trying to bucket the data based on its variability. And so the easiest way to explain that is, in a data set, you might see a peak and a valley. It's trying to kind of slice that up and bucket those based on the peaks and valleys. And so it's more of a programmatic way to try to find natural breakpoints in that data set by grouping it on its variability. And so that's the third option that we expose. And what I'd say about any one of these scenarios is, as you slice those into zones, you can customize these. So if you want to say, I want to standardize my process, so across every image that I create, or every zone, I should say, I want this to run maybe 0.58, and this is going to be 0.6. So this range is quite tight in this case. But you can customize those values, the breakpoint values, and go fully custom, and then save this off as a profile. So webinar zones. And now each additional field that I do, I can just use this profile, and it will use those custom breakpoints if you want to go to that extent. The other thing I would say is common is the minimum zone size. So you could say I want maybe quantiles again, but I don't want any zones that are smaller than 1/4 of an acre. I'm not going to treat those any different. So I can run quantiles, but a 1/4 of an acre break, and now you got a map looking like this. So with that, you can get very deep into customization, or you can use the defaults and get to a pretty quick quality map using that imagery. At this point, we've got our zones, but we do allow you to edit these. And so this is a feature people really like, just with the ease of customization. So as an agronomist, you might know, looking at this field, that you don't want to create these as separate zones. You want to blend those into the underlying area. And maybe over here, same thing, you want to blend that in. And so here is just, think of it as a paintbrush tool to go through and edit these zones. And so you can do that. The other use case here is you can also break this into grids. So you could say, I want to slice the zones into 100-foot grids. And again, the use case here would be some of the applicators may need it broken into grids, but what I would explain from our standpoint is doing this would allow you to have more granularity in that paintbrush tool. So doing this, I now have all that data broken down into grids, and I can come back into the paintbrush tool, and I could round this out and edit that in this way. The other potential use case you might run into here is to say, I've got my zones, but I want to run a strip trial in this case of saying every zone I have here is going to get a fixed rate, but I want to run a 0 rate trial in the middle. So I can create a 6 bucket here, and then just manually paint where you want that data to fall. So for example, again, we're going to do a check strip in the middle of the field, and we're going to make this as a 0 rate application. So I've done that. I can also change the colors. So if you want to say, if you're particular about this, make that neon green and save that out. There's also some additional tools where you can take, for example, if you've got an irrigated pivot, you can slice out the zone that we create by irrigated versus non-irrigated if you've got a pre-existing zone that just represents that area. Or you could use some draw tools around creating your own circles on the fly to slice that data out. So there's a fair amount of tools here which you can get into and customize. But for now, we'll say we're happy with these zones. A couple things I would mention here is I can call this the webinar zones one. I can create these, and I could then move on and go to my next field, create the zones. Or I can create and immediately write my prescription. So in this case, we'll do that. We're going to create a prescription. We're going to say, based on those zones, I want to do a urea application. So I put my attribute name in here. We do support multi-attribute. So I could also say urea and potash. The precision here, I get asked about this. This is simply the number of decimals you want to have included in that final output for the monitor to use. So from here, now I've got my zone map, which we display, so I can quickly reference back to this to know where those zones are. We show you the zone name, we show you the number of area or acreage that falls into each bucket. And again, we did quantiles, so those should be very close to each other. Now with urea, let's say I want to run this 300 pounds to the top end. Well, let's invert that, 100 pounds on the low end and 300 pounds on the top end, the high NDVI values, or perhaps the more healthy plants. Now with this, I have the check trial scenario where I've got that 6 zone that I want to put a 0 rate in on. So I'll set that up, but now I can do this autofill button. So now I could say that range, I've got 100 pounds, 300, we'll autofill those other buckets with equal steps of increasing rates. And with that, we'll do that over here. We'll say potash, we're going 300 to 600, and again, a flat rate here. And so now that fills those additional buckets or zones. And I can see the total pounds of urea going into each zone, along with the sum, the total pounds of urea across the whole field, the average rate, and the total area being applied. And so With that, we can do a couple things. So these colors still represent the colors of the zones themselves. You can customize this again to say, I want, the PDF that goes to grower, I want this zone to be neon green, and you could do that here if you wanted. And so there's more of just I would call this a legend change, where it just shows the view that goes to the client. It's not changing the raw data at all behind the scenes. So now we're done with the zone map. So I'm going to download this, and what we can do from the screen is you can export to Shapefile, and you can also export and get a PDF. So doing that, I'm going to have my Shapefile available. So just to crack this open, you can see that's going to contain your Shapefile components, and it will have all that raw data about application rates. And then the PDF looks like this, where it's going to have your logo on it. It's got the zones defined within the map, along with the data table down here, just showing you the NDVI ranges. It'll show you the acreage like we saw on the web, and then the total breakdowns and average rates and total product needed. Another comment on this is, let's say I wanted to use that zone map for creating that urea prescription like I mentioned. I can also reuse that later on and maybe write a seeding script. So doing that, here's access to all my zones, and I've got that webinar zone that we created as part of this. I can jump back in and use this little beaker icon and write my new seeding prescription, but on the same zones. So now I'm saying I got 25,000 seeds per acre, and let's go, well, we'll just ignore the check strip in this case, and we'll go to 40,000. So I can autofill that, download. Now I've got a new prescription available for my seeding. And in that exact same scenario as well, is we can look at all of our prescriptions, and now I could take all the prescriptions for, let's say, Munson farms, and I could push those into a single shapefile or a single PDF. And I did that by multi-selecting and hitting export here. And so now I can put this on a single flash drive. I could email this out as a single file instead of one shapefile per prescription. So that's kind of a bulk export tool with those prescriptions. Another thing I'll mention, so we just added in, we had a lot of requests when I was going through the same demo with a lot of leads. They were asking to say, I want to create my zone maps, but I want to utilize multiple NDVI images. So this is a brand new feature as of last week, actually. We added in the ability to multi-select. And so what we'll do here is you can see this multi-select button. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into multi-select mode. And now I can look through and kind of shop around and look at these images and say, yeah, this from 2023, I like this image best. And then I'm going to go back into 2022, same time window, and I'm going to add this to the shopping cart. So you can see I've got two images in here now, and I'm going to go back into 21, shopping cart, add, and we'll do the last 2 years here. So we'll go August 19, add that one in. So now I've got all four of these that I've put in my shopping cart, and I can kind of review that before I go into zone creation. So now this is, you can see the timeline down here jumping around as I click those images. So the value of doing this would be to try to take out the variability of any one season. If you had a dry year, a wet year, this is trying to kind of standardize that data set across multiple years and just try to evaluate the differences that the crop or the plant itself is showing. So now if I create zones, and again, let's maybe do quantiles, and I go next. So now this will look exactly the same going forward as it did in the prior scenarios, but I did this based on 4 images instead of a single image. So that's a brand new feature we added in, and it's available to everybody now as well. So a couple of things I would say here, we've talked about how to view the imagery both on the web and mobile. But the other thing I'd mention here is that I talked through viewing one field, kind of the average NDVI profile. What I want to call out next is that within our analytics tool, you can start to take a step back and say what's going on across our whole operation or across a particular grower. And so a couple of the views we have available, let me actually go into my report tab. So in general, analytics, this is where you can take any of the data that you capture in FarmQA and slice this into views that would help you make a decision. So I'm going to look at all my imagery, what we call metrics, and I'm going to break this down by producer. So I have Minnesota farms and North Dakota farms. As I look through these columns, here's my average NDVI value for the most recent image. So I can see the average and look to see how does insect trap field compare to the average or this field, field corn. So there's just a quick kind of view of this, and you can also run filters to say just show me the fields that are higher than X or certain values. And so with that, again, going back to management, you could say, show me, maybe you're sitting in August and you're trying to do early disease detection. You could say, show me all the potato fields that are low on the red band index. And so I could set a filter to say, filter this to say less than, let's just say, I don't even know what would be a good value in this case, 0.25. So now all my data, actually all my data is lower than that. So we'll go filter and we'll say 0.18. So now this data will filter down and just show me that data set. And then I can start to task from here to say, let's send out a team of scouts to look at these fields, or start pulling up the actual visual imagery back on that map view where you can see everything at once. So that's how you can kind of dispatch from here. But you can also click on any one of these cells and you can get into that by season comparison to say, how is this year comparing to a prior year? To say, well, maybe this is just an earlier maturing region of our operation, for example. And then with this, these are interactable. So you want to say, just show me these particular years. We go corn every other year, for example, or say 23 versus the average. And then you can export these out. So if you want to send this to a client, you can export out just that view. And now you've got this graph that you can send to a producer, and you can show them, how that trend is looking. The other thing I'd call out within here is you can start to create views that compare, let's say, NDVI across all your fields. So what this is doing, in my case, it's showing that average NDVI by season, but it's taking every field within my account and it's averaging that. So now you could look at the average of all the fields on 24 versus 21 or 20 and see how that compares. But I can also quickly filter this, and let's go 23 to 21. I can easily filter this by my folders. And so if you think about this would be potential clients. And so I could say, just average that same graph, but do it for Minnesota farms. We're going to re-render that, but just for that subfolder of mine. So it's an easy way to slice your data out in a quick view, quick access view to get these charts. I've also got a scenario here where I'm just looking at every line in this case is an individual field within my Minnesota farms folder. And so what you can see here is the fields that are maturing quicker, the ones that are kind of following more of an average curve. And to be honest, I don't know if these are all corn fields. It's just data fields in my account. But the use case here is to say we have customers that do harvest timing. And if they're looking at a series of alfalfa fields or whatever it may be, you can see which fields are maturing quicker, which ones are going to be ready for harvest. And so of this, it's a quick way to do that. And then you could isolate those fields to pull these lines in and out and just look at those particular comparisons. And so that's a quick access view and comparison for really any scenario. If you're doing which fields got hail damage, that will very much stand out in a chart like this of saying, here's all of our kind of our standard growth pattern we're following. But you can see this guy, maybe he got hit by hail damage. Let's go take a look. Additionally, I talked about those different indexes and how, like, let's say NDVI washes out mid-season. That's where you can see practically how you could use NDRE. It has more kind of headspace, or it doesn't cap out at the range that NDVI does. And so that's just where you compare different indexes to each other, of course, across the course of a season. Now, this is where our value add comes in, is you can start to look at, let's say, your NDVI growth profile for a field, but compare that to the GDUs on that field or the precipitation events across the season. So if you think about doing a postseason autopsy on a field, you could say what went wrong, what went well. This is a very quick way just to look at all the, let's say, external factors. So the weather data is projected across potentially the crop health, if you think of NDVI in that sense. And so you can look at your fields that way, get a snapshot, and you can export that out as well to send that out just directly. So with that, that's a pretty quick access way or an overview. And I'm sure there's some questions, so I want to leave plenty of time. Like I said, this is available to anybody who wants to look at Sentinel imagery and FarmQA. And then you can use it, like I said, directed scouting, create zones, like I talked about there, combine multiple NDVIs to create zones. I'll also put a plug in here for our branded portal. And so let's say you are interested in imagery, or maybe you're looking at building your own imagery portal. With that, we can brand our system in the sense that you can put your logos, your color around our website and the mobile app. And so this could look like, if you're a co-op or retailer, you'd have your own branded portal website like this to use to view imagery and put in the hands of growers or clients. And so with that, I'll just mention, as you set up users, we have the permissioning around, I'm going to add a new user, but I'm just going to grant them access as a grower role within maybe Minnesota Farms. If I hit save, now they have access to that imagery as well. So they can be viewing those NDVI images as they're sitting in the sprayer and completing a recommendation that you maybe sent to them. And so there's the whole grower portal side, and they do indeed have access to that Sentinel imagery and can utilize that as well. So perhaps additional value with that.